Good morning, dear friends. My name is Igor Yakovenko. It is now 7 hours 41 minutes in Kiev. Today, February 23rd, we continue our morning reflections about what is happening in Russia, in the world, in Ukraine, and in our souls. I'll start with some news that could be called quite bad, although, in general, it's not really anything that I would consider to be new news. Possible Trojan horses in the European Union, Orban, Fico, and the film party have finally derailed from reality entirely. The government of Hungary has now signaled that it intends to also block the formal approval of the 20th package of economic sanctions currently being prepared against Russia. All for the same reason, because of the cessation of Russian oil transit through the Druzhba pipeline. The Hungarian Minister of Foreign Affairs Péter Szijjártó recently posted on social media explaining that as long as Ukraine does not resume regular oil transit to Hungary and Slovakia via the Druzhba pipeline, the Hungarian government will continue to block progress on any decision that is important for Kyiv. In other words, as they say, let them. Putin will seize Ukraine and then continue his advance deeper into Europe, where to, it really doesn't matter at all. The sheer absolute idiocy of this particular statement becomes immediately obvious to everyone once we take a moment to understand exactly why, in fact, the Druzhba pipeline is no longer supplying oil to the nations of Hungary and Slovakia. And the reason is very simple. The fact of the matter is that the sudden shutdown of the vital Druzhba pipeline actually happened as a direct result of Russian missile strikes. Well, since it is pointless to try appealing to Putin, inevitably, Ukraine was the one that ended up being blamed. As a result, both Hungary and Slovakia are now facing the consequences of this situation, are doing the following things. First, they are threatening to block the 20th package of sanctions against Russia. In other words, they are taking an obviously pro-Russian stance. In other words, Russia has effectively destroyed one of the central hubs of the major oil pipeline known as Druzhba. And as a result, Hungary, and apparently Slovakia are threatening to completely cancel, to effectively block sanctions against Russia. Well, logic, what logic? No, it seems that word simply doesn't exist. This rhetoric has become increasingly common in the political vocabulary of Hungarian and Slovak politicians. Furthermore, Hungary and Slovakia are threatening to halt the electricity supply to Kyiv if the Ukrainian government does not resume the transit of Russian oil. And besides all that, Orban has already publicly stated and made it clear that he fully intends to block and veto the European Union's loan package for Ukraine, worth a massive 90 billion euros, which was previously voted on by the European Commission, including with the direct participation of both Hungary and Slovakia. In addition to this, Orban recently had a very striking and highly controversial encounter. It was such a speech that was very clearly delivered with a pre-election tone in mind. He stated that those individuals who firmly believe Putin and Russia are the enemies of Europe are completely and utterly mistaken, and that the real enemy is not found in Moscow, but rather in Brussels. Well, when you look at it, in actual fact, this is pure madness, controlled madness, and these horses have bolted off-road, and it was definitely not by accident. They have completely lost control of themselves and have fully switched to a pro-Russian policy. In other words, the coachman who is actually controlling these two Trojan horses right now is named Vladimir Putin. This has now become absolutely obvious to everyone. In fact, it was known before, but here, as they say, it has shown itself in full measure. Ukraine reacted to these developments in an entirely justified and appropriate manner, because indeed oil deliveries through the Druzhba pipeline were disrupted as a direct result of the ongoing Russian bombings. Well, and besides all that, Kiev has repeatedly stated that Hungary and Slovakia's continued purchases of Russian oil and gas are directly helping to fund the war. Russia's war against Ukraine. Well, quite obviously, the pro-Russian stance of these two leaders, the current leadership of these two nations, no longer needs any further proof. It is just, well, simply put, Vladimir Putin's mark is stamped on the foreheads of both Fico and Orban. Well, that's the situation. I have not the slightest doubt that the European Union will solve this problem. It's just that this problem will take time to resolve. That is, a certain number of Ukrainians and Russians as well, of course, will die as a result of this. And obviously, this will simply require substantial funding because both Hungary and Slovakia are not net donors to the European Union, but are rather recipients of donor aid from the EU, and therefore, in essence, they are essentially countries that depend on these external funds to support their national development. These are political parasites who, so to speak, live off the European Union institutions in Brussels, yet they diligently work to create trouble in favor of Vladimir Putin. That is basically the whole story as it stands at this point in time. When it comes to the question of how this problem can be solved overall, I honestly have no idea at all. Because, as they often say, the European Union was originally created as a union of sovereign and equal countries, states that are meant to trust each other. And just as, in general, the comprehensive Euro-Atlantic Alliance was formed as a strategic union of NATO nations in particular, these are nations that share a unified perspective on complex global processes and international developments. And then you see suddenly there's Trump. There you go. And the European Union was also formed as it is a community of diverse countries that primarily share the same democratic values. And then suddenly now there's Orban, then Fico, and even a third one, and the Czech government, and so on. So in reality, certain significant events are happening now that are compelling both the foundations of the transatlantic community and the European one to undergo a transformation. But how do you change them when the principles of trust were at the core? And now it turns out that several other situations have changed quite a bit. And honestly, who could have ever anticipated that? Although this was predicted, many predicted that democracy is to a large extent made by people, and the arrival of certain newly arriving people could potentially undermine the foundations of this democratic, liberal world order. That is, this unconditional faith in institutions. This perspective assumes that the people working in these institutions share the core goals for which these institutions were created. And if that does not happen to be the case in reality, well, then you get leaders like Trump, you get Orban, or you get Fico. But today, we also have some positive news to share with you. This particular piece of news isn't from today or even yesterday. It actually dates back to Saturday night. On that Saturday night, a military plant in Votkinsk, Udmurtia, was targeted and successfully attacked. In general terms, Udmurtia is known for being a very heavily militarized region. It is no coincidence that one of Udmurtia's most celebrated national heroes is Mr. or Comrade Kalashnikov. Udmurtia is absolutely packed with large-scale military factories, and one of these military factories, called the Votkinsk plant, is responsible for producing missiles for systems such as the systems include the Iskander M, the Topol M, and the Oreshnik. That is at least what I am personally aware of at this time. So this is a very serious and highly significant strategic defense enterprise. It is an industrial enterprise where much of the weaponry that is launched at Ukraine and causes such destruction is actually produced. It kills Ukrainians and creates conditions that essentially make it possible This effectively enables Russia to have the necessary military capability to carry out the genocide of Ukraine. And so, on the night leading into Saturday, this significant strike was carried out. So, I am going to ask my colleagues right now to show us the specific video footage that was published by Denis Stillerman. He is the owner and the chief designer of the company known as Firepoint, which is responsible for manufacturing these particular missiles. And here is a short video, as he wrote, without context. The context will come later. Let's take a look. It is a pity that there is absolutely no sound here. The audio is actually very pleasant. Well, that is the entire story behind it. In fact, it is a truly impressive video, in my personal opinion. And actually, the context is very simple and straightforward. The distance from Votkinsk to the border with Ukraine is almost 1,500 kilometers. And the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed that these were Flamingo missile strikes on the Votkinsk plant. I still can't quite understand. I even asked Sergei Maratovich Grabsky, what exactly is the Flamingo? It seems to look like an unmanned aerial vehicle, but now it's already being referred to as a missile, so well, let us take a look at it. Let's settle on something. I'll keep calling the Flamingo a missile from now on. But Flamingo can strike its targets at a distance of 1,500 kilometers. Moreover, it's perfectly clear to everyone that the air defense, and I have not the slightest doubt that such a strategic defense enterprise as the Votkinsk plant was, of course, exceptionally well protected by air defense systems. That is, in the initial stages, when there was a lot of discussion about what the Flamingo was, there was actually a great deal of talk that, due to its large physical size and certain other issues, it would be easy to shoot down. But it turns out, no, it doesn't get shot down. This sophisticated weapon successfully breaks through even the most advanced Russian air defenses. Therefore, when we carefully consider its extensive operational range and the immense destructive power of its warhead, I believe this is a strategic asset capable of creating incredibly serious and lasting problems for Putin's regime. This is especially true given that the Flamingo drone can definitely reach as far as Moscow. Furthermore, given the sheer power and precision of this weapon, it is fully equipped to carry out devastating precision strikes against high-value targets deep within enemy territory, not only against military, but also against military political targets. Moreover, the same principle applies here. A researcher named Denis Stillerman, he has recently published his findings. The glow over the Neftegorsk. The gas processing plant is already in the Greater Samara region. That is, the Flamingo, well, as they say, is truly demonstrating its significant power. And this without a doubt inspires optimism. On another related note, I wouldn't say it's entirely what I would call good news, but at least it's a positive event that happened recently, is that, in my own personal opinion, the BBC has to some extent successfully rehabilitated the professional honor of the Western press. I mean, the recent interview of Volodymyr Zelensky by Jeremy Bowen. This is BBC News. And I really have to say, when you look at it compared to everything that was happening before this, especially with the Western press, I am talking about that absolutely insane and controversial publication by the Financial Times, which was then followed by The Economist and then several other major outlets as well. Associated Press. Well, in other words, a whole series of publications that, as it seems to me, are yet another series of disgraces for the world press. So the BBC recently conducted an interview with President Zelensky, and from my own point of view, it was truly remarkable. To be honest, Jeremy Bowen essentially gave a masterclass to Western journalists on how to properly work, and please excuse me for using a technical term here, on how to effectively work with this kind of material in a professional way. In this case, for journalists, the material is politicians. That is, the person did not take any particular position, did not become just a microphone stand, which Putin really likes, by the way. In fact, any politician likes it when a journalist takes on that role, just being a microphone stand. So Jeremy Bowen was not just a passive observer holding a microphone, but he also wasn't a provocateur who, so to speak, tries to corner someone, as happened, for example, in the interview with General Zaluzhny, where the US press did exactly that. But in any case, it was an honest, calm, and tough, but quite objective interview. And President Zelensky simply shared his personal views, and perspectives with the group of journalists gathered there. He didn't interfere. On the contrary, he helped to reveal his real views about what is happening. And Zelensky emphasized that, from his perspective, Ukraine is not losing the war, will end it with a victory, and explained exactly what victory means for Ukraine, firmly and clearly stating the specific reasons why he is categorically opposed to meeting Vladimir Putin's various demands for a complete military withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the fortified areas of Donbass. He stated that Putin has already started World War III. And, well, to put it in simple terms, he answered a wide variety of questions, in particular regarding Vladimir Putin's insistent demand, and not only Putin's, to give up those 20% of the territories in the Donbass that are currently under dispute. Under Ukraine's control, he responded very simply. Let me find this quote for you now. Just a second. Here's my cheat sheet. Here it is. I just see this differently. I don't look at it simply as land or not only as land. This is how I see it. To withdraw, that is to weaken our positions, to abandon hundreds of thousands of our people who are there. That's how I see it. To divide our society by such a withdrawal. And then what happened? He took the opportunity to explain at length why he believes the statements made by many politicians, including Donald Trump, are unfair. For example, Trump has repeatedly claimed that Ukraine is losing the war. He emphasized that, in his view, Ukraine will likely be defeated if it does not agree to make some concessions to Putin. This, he argued, is a point that is often overlooked in discussions. And here is how Zelensky responded to that. Very simply. Here's the quote. "And where are you right now?" Zelensky asked. "Today you are in Kyiv, the capital of our motherland. Are we losing? No, of course not, because we are fighting for Ukraine's independence." So basically, it is actually a very solid argument when someone thoroughly explains in detail more exactly why there is absolutely no defeat at all. A very important point is where the journalist asked the president of Ukraine how he understands victory. Here I'll just paraphrase because the answer is very long. The point is that victory, it means the return of Ukrainians, a normal life and an end to the killing of people. In other words, it does not mean the immediate return of all territories. But a broader understanding of victory, which again is the second level that Zelensky mentioned, is the complete elimination of the significant global threat posed by Putin. To stop Putin, to prevent him from successfully occupying Ukraine, that is the victory for the world. So, moving forward from there, when he was asked whether he considers victory to be the return of all territories, Zelensky said that we will do this in any case, but it's a matter of time. If we try to do it today, it would mean losing a large number of people, millions, because the enemy's army is large. And besides everything else, there isn't a sufficient amount of weaponry. That is to say, when he was asked a question regarding whether people should prepare for a protracted and difficult war in Ukraine, he responded by pointing out that these are two separate and parallel tracks. So which of these options should ultimately be chosen? There are many parallel steps, and one of these parallel paths will bring success. Success means stopping Putin. That is, Vladimir Putin does not want to bring an end to this war, but not wanting does not mean he will not eventually do so. Well, in general, to put it briefly, that's it. From my personal point of view, in such an interview, the BBC journalist simply gave President Zelensky a rare opportunity to openly say exactly what he thinks, which unfortunately does not happen very often at all, and that is certainly a good thing. Furthermore, there is one specific event that, in my humble opinion, is also quite significant, which happened just last week. Keep in mind, we are broadcasting live today on Monday, and this particular event happened last Thursday. An interesting event occurred that opens yet another window into the complex picture that is taking shape in Russia today. It was on Thursday, February 19th. He died of a heart attack. The 65-year-old artist Alexander Dotsenko. He died in a penal colony. After his death, his family, no one informed them about what had happened. So the entire family only actually discovered the truth about it completely by accident, because it was the doctors at a St. Petersburg hospital who informed them. That's it. So Alexander Dotsenko was sentenced to serve a prison term of 3 years after he was found guilty of the charges. He and his wife, the professional artist Anastasia Dudaeva, were both officially accused of inciting terrorism. As a result of the trial, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, while she received a longer term of 3.5 years. The so-called terrorism consisted of the fact that they were placing postcards with poems and sayings in Ukrainian next to goods in a hypermarket. Postcards with poems and statements in Ukrainian, in other words, poems in Ukrainian, are considered terrorism. Well, that's basically all you need to know about the Putin regime. The special operation to go ahead and arrest these two elderly individuals who have reached retirement age. This operation was carried out with the direct involvement of the FSB and OMON. That is to say, to the home of these two elderly individuals, an FSB unit was dispatched, reinforced by an OMON squad. Well, essentially, that is exactly what you need to know about this situation. So all these supposedly heroic fighters, about whom countless blockbuster movies are now being made, dramatic action films about the valiant Alpha, the FSB, the OMON, and the National Guard. All this celebrated heroism somehow doesn't show itself in Ukraine, because here, when they face a real, determined, and well-armed opponent, they simply can't do anything at all. But the heroic arrest of two defenseless elderly artists, that's exactly the kind of valor they're truly capable of showing. So basically, that's what I wanted to say today. But as it seems to me, the most significant concern is the rampaging Trojan horses under the control of Vladimir Putin and the power that Flamingo is demonstrating. These are two distinct pieces of news that effectively counteract one another. But it honestly appears to me, will the European Union be able to successfully halt these rampaging horses, these dangerous Trojan horses? I'm not confident about that. This is a problem that can be solved with money. As for the Flamingo, I think it's completely impossible to effectively intercept this weapon. Russia is simply not capable of doing so at this time.